The United Nations is about to turn 80, and to be honest, it's facing a massive crisis. This isn't just another bump in the road in its long, complicated history. There's a real feeling that this time things are different, maybe a lot more serious. So let's dive in and really unpack what's going on with one of the world's most important institutions.
And that's not just my take. That stark assessment comes straight from analysts who are watching this whole thing unfold. I mean, think about it. This is an organization that survived the Cold War, countless regional conflicts, you name it. But the feeling now is that the current crisis is a unique threat to its very existence.
And here's the central irony in all of this, the real twist. The United States, the country that was the main architect of the UN, the architect of the whole post-World War II global order, is now seen as the primary force that could bring the entire system crashing down, whether it's on purpose or just by neglect. So let's really dig into this American dilemma. How exactly did the UN's biggest historical champion become the source of its biggest crisis? Well, the sources we're looking at point to two really big things.
First off, you've got the money. The US is very publicly, very deliberately cutting its funding. And second, and this one is maybe even more fundamental, it's about values. The core UN idea that you don't just invade your neighbors, that borders are sacred, is being chipped away at. Not just by countries like Russia, but by some of the talk coming from American political figures too.
To really get the impact of these funding cuts, you just have to look at this one number. America is number one, the single biggest contributor, and it's not even close. That's for both the core budget that keeps the lights on and for the voluntary funds for things like humanitarian aid. So you can imagine when the US starts to turn off that tap, the entire system feels a serious chill.
And this isn't just theoretical. The consequences are very, very real. We're seeing some UN branches having to slash their budgets by a third, critical humanitarian missions are facing huge shortfalls, and there's just this cloud of uncertainty hanging over the whole organization, which makes any kind of long-term planning basically impossible. Okay, so this all brings us to the biggest question of all. Given this crisis, what does the future actually hold? The source material we're looking at lays out three pretty distinct paths for where the United Nations could go. So yeah, where does the UN go from here? Let's break down the three scenarios that the experts are talking about. They're calling them a rogue UN that sort of breaks away from American influence, a decaying UN which just slowly withers away, and a Trumpified UN which gets reshaped to serve a very different kind of American foreign policy.
Now this first scenario, the rogue UN, is pretty wild. The idea is that the US just fully leaves or gets pushed out over all these funding fights. And what happens then? A huge power vacuum. And you can bet countries like China and Russia would rush to fill it. They'd start setting the global rules for everything from AI to trade. And that could create a world that's a lot more hostile to American interests.
But as dramatic as that sounds, the sources suggest it's actually not the most probable outcome. What's seen as most likely is a much slower, grinding decline. They're calling it a decaying UN.
In this future, the US doesn't actually pull out. It just sticks around, but disengaged, neglected. The result? Less money, less ambition, less action across the board. The huge UN structure, all those 140-plus agencies, they'd probably survive. But they'd be a hollowed-out, shrunken version of their former selves, just doing less of everything.
Then you have this third possibility, which is really fascinating, the Trumpified UN. The idea here isn't to destroy or abandon the institution, but to co-opt it. The US would basically cherry-pick the parts of the UN it finds useful, like, say, funding refugee agencies to manage migration far away from its own borders. The UN General Assembly could become less of a diplomatic body and more of a stage for flashy transactional deal-making, valued more for the show than the substance.
So, after all that doom and gloom, it's fair to ask, is there any possible upside here? Could all of this disruption and chaos actually force some much-needed reform? Is there a silver lining?
You know, there's actually a precedent for this. Just think about NATO. When Donald Trump was threatening to walk out because allies weren't paying their fair share, what happened? A lot of them did increase their defense spending. He then took credit for it. It's not impossible to imagine a similar dynamic playing out at the UN, where a really disruptive approach ends up forcing change that can be framed as a win.
But, and this is the huge but, real fundamental change at the UN means you have to tackle the elephant in the room, its most powerful and most outdated part, the Security Council. Is that even possible?
This quote really just says it all, doesn't it? The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China, the ones with the veto power, they are never going to willingly vote to make themselves less powerful. And without them on board, any meaningful reform of the Council is basically dead on arrival.
So as we wrap this up, it's worth looking at a pretty stark warning from history, because it reminds us that just doing good, useful work, well, that doesn't guarantee your survival.
And let's not forget about the unsung heroes here. Because beneath all the high-stakes political drama, specialized UN agencies do work that is absolutely essential. The ICAO keeps you safe when you fly. The IAEA helps keep civil nuclear power safe. This technical, vital work happens every single day, out of the spotlight.
But this is where that history lesson comes in. The League of Nations, the UN's predecessor, also did a lot of really valuable technical work. And it failed. It completely collapsed. Why? Because its most powerful members just lost the political will to keep it going. All its good work just wasn't enough to save it.
And that leaves us with the final, unavoidable question. The UN's vital work, big and small, continues all over the world, day in and day out. But in this new era of shifting alliances and wavering commitment, will its most powerful members, especially the one that brought it into being, still want it to survive?